All right. Everyone get a good view of the eclipse yesterday? It's pretty cool. It's pretty cool. I think I had the best view, but it was cool. I think my glasses were off or something. But anyhow, at least I'm not blind. It was amazing. Yeah, it was. It was. My friend has a very expensive camera set up, and he took some amazing photographs of it. Yeah, and I'm jealous I didn't get any good photographs of it. I don't think I am smart enough to work my iPhone camera or something like that. All right. Today we're getting into really one of the most important aspects of server-side scripting, and that is interacting with a database. Pretty much everything that we've gone over so far, actually, you probably could do with client-side JavaScript. I mean, you could calculate a student's tuition with client-side JavaScript, and you could calculate someone's heartbeat range for exercising with JavaScript. And you could do a Mad Lib with JavaScript. But database is the first thing that we're going to do that really well, it does have to be server-side. It would be very difficult, it would be impractical, and it would be insecure if you came up with a configuration to allow someone from the client side to access your database. I'm not saying it's impossible, because you can do a lot of things, right? But it would just in general not be a good idea. Therefore, you don't even consider doing database interactivity on the client side. You want that security of it being on your own server. So again, we've talked about servers in this class before, and we talked about them in terms of being a web server. A web server is one kind of server that we talked about, and the first kind we talked about, but it's not the only kind of server that exists. A server is loosely defined, is a computer system that handles requests and provides a response. That's probably the most generic definition of a server that I could give. And in our case, we have the client connected to the internet. It's connected to a web server that is responsible for connecting to pages on the web. And these can either be static or dynamic. So these pages are either static or dynamic, and the server either just delivers them if they're static, or it does some processing if they're dynamic. Well, one of the processing that might happen is to connect to a database server. And a database server, again, is a system that connects to a relational database and handles requests and responses. So the web server itself doesn't really talk directly to the database. No applications talk directly to the database. Applications go through a web server and make requests to the database. Now, this is a little less, it might be a little cloudy in our case, because in our case, your computer is playing the role of web server and database server, but they wouldn't have to be the same machine even. They could be a different machine on your network. And in a larger organization, that would definitely be the case. You would have a dedicated web server that's what it did, and you'd have a web server and that's what it would do. All right, but just want to show how this interaction works. So you have a couple of things to install, and my suggestion is that you install them early on in the week, because you want to make sure everything is working before you even try to do the assignment. All right, because if you don't have things installed properly, of course you're going to be fighting a doomed battle, right? Because you won't be able to access it, and you'll wonder why, and you'll think it's your code, but it might just be that you have something set up incorrectly. So I have a list of things for you to do, and I have some resources. installing MySQL. I don't have any documentation on that. Many of you got it when you got XAMPP. Do make sure that the MySQL server is running though. All right, that's one thing that you need to do. The other piece of software you need to install is MySQL Workbench. And that allows you, it's a workbench, allows you to do stuff to your MySQL database. All right. I have an instruction to change the password in this module. We are going to be using a different form of authentication than is the default. So we have to change our password before this will work. And the database is in this zip file. It's part of the module. So this is a write-up about the database. This is a web page about the database. This is the instruction to change the password. This is the data for the database. And this is the PHP code to access the offices from the database. Okay, so let's say you've downloaded MySQL and it's running. Let's say you have downloaded MySQL Workbench. What do you do to set this up? And I would suggest that you duplicate exactly what I'm doing in class today. You know, have the lecture going in a separate window and do the steps one at a time. When I say to do something, go and do it on your end and make sure you get the same results. So in this case, we're going to assume that we've installed MySQL and MySQL Workbench, and MySQL Workbench is running. So I'm going to go here. Under MySQL, one of the options is MySQL Workbench. You might get prompted for a password. All right. If you do, I hope you remember the password that you used to create it. It's very possible you create it with no password, which again would be a horrible idea for an actual production database, but is forgivable in our case. So I'm going to collect on my local instance. This is this MySQL Workbench could connect to any number of different databases. So I have MySQL running on my machine right here. All right. There could be within our organization another database server that also runs MySQL database, in which case I might see that data connection there. So maybe the test database, which is in another web server, and then maybe the production database, which is on another, I said web server, I meant database server. All right. So you could see more than one MySQL connection. You probably will only see one. If you don't see that, go up and click Connect to Database and provide the credentials. So I'm going to click on this, and it does its thing, and it comes up with this screen. All right, this screen allows us to do several things. Allows us to check the server status. And in my case, it's information about the server, and the error log is on, and it appears to be running. And other administrative details, server logs. Logs are useful in the case of, you get an error. Sometimes you would get a log. There's options, oops, and so on. We're going to largely ignore this screen, the administrator panel. All right. We're going to go instead into this panel for schemas. Now, a schema is pretty much synonymous with a database. All right. Our connection on that first string, that first screen, that was a database server. And again, we're only going to have one database server. But within a database server, there can be multiple databases. All right. And that's what a schema is. It's a new database. All right. That we're going to use and we're going to do stuff with. So I want to create a new schema, which I can right mouse and say create schema. Now, I unfortunately don't remember what that schema should be called. I think it said here. It's not, but it is included in here. Where you say database, that's the name of the schema, classic models. So I'm going to go and I'm going to create a new schema called classic models and apply. Review the instruction and hit apply. And there I have my schema created. I have my new database created. Now, I'm working under the assumption that you have at least a little bit of familiarity with databases. I don't know if that's valid or not. If I am assuming that you have some knowledge that you don't have, please let me know, and I'll go over and cover it in more detail. Essentially, a database is an entity that we use to store information about multiple different parts of our organization. So for example, there would be a table, a separate table for each sort of component in our organization. So for example, in this case, there's an office table that contains information about the offices of the organization. There's a customer table, which contains customers, and there's many other tables as well. All right. So that is, each one of that stores a table. Now, what makes a database different than other forms of storage is that there are relationships between the different entities are stored. All right. So we have this database. And if we look under tables, there's nothing. We don't have any tables. So we're going to create tables. Now you could go this way and say create a table and all that, but you could also run a script that will create a table and do other stuff for you. So I've provided that script to create this database in this file here, what's it called? MySQL sample database. And I can open this. Let me extract it first. I can open it up and I can see the instructions that are in here. We're creating a database called Classic Models. We're going to use that database for all the subsequent commands. Is looking to see if the table customers exist. If it does, it's going to delete it. So this goes if you happen to have an old table that you created or whatever, it's going to remove it. Then it's going to create a table with these properties. Each table contains multiple attributes or columns of data. So these are the columns of data that are stored. This is information about them. In this case, the customer number is an integer of 11 digits, and it can't be null. It can't be empty. We then have a bunch of test data that gets inserted. Then we do the same thing with employees, and so on down the line. for all the tables. So I can open up that query, or I can copy and paste it in. I'm going to, since there was already a query here, if you need to create a query, you can click this little button to create a new query if there isn't one available there. So I'm going to select all. And copy it. I'm going to paste it into my query screen. Is that right? There's 7,000 lines in this? Well, I'm glad we provided the script instead of having you type it in.
You did.
Pardon me?
You did change the limit to 1,000 rows.
I don't think so. Let's be safe. I think that relates to the number of data in each table. That's the most it can do is 1,000 rows. I don't think there's any table as 1,000. We'll see if it gives me, we'll see if it complains about it. I think that's what it means. All right, so now we're ready to execute that. So how do you execute it? This little lightning bolt. It'll either execute the selected stuff, like if I could just highlight this and just execute that one statement. Or I can hit this and execute everything. All right, it does its thing. And it's done. Looky there. How do I know it's done? Well, little green checks indicate that each instruction ran. And it shows you what it did. So some of these didn't affect any rows, but this inserted 122 customers. This one inserted 23 employees. This one inserted 7 offices, and so on. Now, how do you know that that did that? What if you want to check its work? Well, you'd hit refresh here, and you'd notice now under tables, there are tables in this database. And they're all the tables I have mentioned. So I can right mouse on this, and I can see the first 1,000 rows in that table. So these are the 7 or however many offices. I can see the customers and so on. You could also, if needed, go and make a change to the database. I don't know what I'm doing here. You could make a change to the database and like change a column's properties or whatever, but we don't need to do that. So we have populated our database. All right. So the next thing we have to do, and again, because we're using an older security model, we are going to change the root user's password to password. All right. I'm doing that just so that my example works and so that it'll be easy for me to grade. All right. Because if every one of you had a different password, you know, unless you remember to give me the password, you know, each, it would be very difficult to grade stuff. So this little script here instruction to change password sets the authentication mode and changes the password. I copy it. I'm going to go into MySQL workbench and I'm going to create a new query. Paste that code in and execute it. And it did its thing. All right. So yay, we have set up our database. So once you've installed those two applications, MySQL and MySQL database, that's what you need to do to get your database up and running. Now we can go over to PHP and connect a PHP page to our database. So I'm going to minimize this. I have here the code. No, that's not the code. I have here the code to do it. Offices.php. So I'm going to copy that into my directories, my web server root, which for me is CINetPub www root. If you're running XAMPP, it's going to be something different. So there I have the page, offices there. And I should be able to go and run localhost offices.php. Let's keep our fingers crossed. And there they are, the offices from the database. If you want to double check that, you can go into MySQL Workbench, as I mentioned before. Right mouse on this, say select rows, and there they are. San Francisco, Boston, New York City, Paris, Tokyo, Sydney, and London. All right, so let's look at the code that does that. All right, and this should be understood already, but I'm going to explicitly say it because it kind of drives me nuts when students do this. I used a very bare bones web page here. All right, that's just displaying the table. That's it. There's no CSS, there's no nothing. It doesn't look like a finished web page. Your job is to make it look like a finished web page. All right, so, you know, create the table that is styled differently, make the page look better, put a heading on the page, do what you need to have it look like a completed page. I don't want a lot of extra stuff cluttering my examples, so I don't do that. But part of your responsibility is make every page that you turn in look like a finished web page. Okay, so let's look at the code now that does that. All right, this is a regular PHP page that contains HTML code. Now, this is a code that interacts with the database. And we have the ending of the page. So here's our PHP page. All right, whoa, crap. Leave my elbow on the keyboard. Thank goodness for the undo key. All right, so the first 5 lines are connecting the database, are connecting, let me rephrase that. The first 5 lines are creating an object called $con, which is going to be your pipeline to the database. All right. It is your way of communicating with the database server. It's how you are going to make requests to the database and how you are going to get your responses back. So that's what $con is. You'll notice in line 15. Now, in order to connect to the database, you have to supply credentials. So you have to supply these 4 credentials, the host name. This will be 127.0.0.1 for you. It also should work if you put the word localhost in there. Because both of those mean your machine that you're working on. All right. If you were on another machine within your organization, you would put the IP address of that. But in our case, 127.0.0.1 is the IP address of your local machine. Or again, you can use localhost. Username, root. In practice, it wouldn't be a good thing to use a root for this. You probably would want to create separate user accounts. But this isn't a database administration class, so I don't want to spend the time talking about creating user accounts and that kind of thing. So the root is the one user that you know exists on this database, the root. The password is password. Again, horrible in production, but makes things simple for you. Having a consistent database makes things simple for me too, because then I can set up my database, run your code, and it should work without me making any changes to either. Then finally, the database name is Classic Models. That is the name of the schema. Classic Models, the schema or the database. Notice that this is in a try statement. The try statement, what it does is it tries to execute this code. If it gets a problem, it's going to run to the catch section and display a message about the exception that it gets. If you've done C# coding or Java coding, you've probably seen try catches before. But if you have not, that's what that means. Try these statements. If at any point one of these gives you an error, jump to the catch and output and then finish. So what kind of error might you get? Let's say I spelled root wrong. I put 2 T's in it. I'm not editing the right version. So let's say I spell root wrong. I accidentally key it wrong and put a double T in there. So I'll go and save that. Now when I click refresh, nothing happens. That's weird. We're expected to get this. Let me go change the PHP any. I don't think that has anything to do with it, but it might. Copy it to the desktop. You should make a backup of PHP any if you do anything like this, which I'm going to do. Edit it. And somewhere down here, display errors on. Save it. in here. Okay. Yeah, there we go. We get an error. This is actually not the exception call. This is an instruction that blew up. So it says access denied for root. Oh, call the undefined function. Maybe that exception is a mistake in the exception line. Anyhow, this gives you a more meaningful description of what's wrong. Okay. So that's creating the pipe to connect to the database. Now we're going to actually execute a SQL statement. SQL or SQL is standard query language. It's the language by which you interact with the database. And we're keeping things real simple here. We're executing this statement, which is called a query. Using this connection. And this is the statement we're executing. Select star from offices. Now, what does that mean? Select says essentially give me. Give me star. Star means everything. So give me every column that's in the table offices. So select says I want to return some data. Star means every column. I wouldn't have to use every column. I could enumerate the columns and say, you know, office ID, office name, whatever the names of the fields were. But I can go and do that. And you see when I run that, that's what I get. Well, we're going to execute that within our code. And we're going to put the results in this variable called result. All right. Let's take a minute to look at what this result looks like. Notice what we get back if we do the query right within MySQL workbench. We get a list of rows and we get a list of columns. So what we're going to get back is an array. All right. We're actually going to get back a two-dimensional array. Every line, every row in this is going to be its own array. And then there's an array for all the rows. So it's a two-dimensional array. We're going to loop through this. We're going to say, give me the first row, give me the second row, give me the third row, fourth row. We're going to do that as long as there's rows remaining. And then from each row, we're going to specify what we want. Now, I could specify that one of two ways. I could specify it using the name of the column, or I could specify it using the number of the column, the number starting with 0. So this would be column 0, column 1, column 2. But usually that's kind of confusing because who remembers what column 0 is or whatever. So you usually use the name of the column. So in this case, I'm going to say I want the office code. So let's look at what we're doing here. So this gives us a result. The result is a two-dimensional array. It's a table. We're going to echo out the table tags. We're going to loop through for each row. That's what this means. For each row in that result. For each row in that result, we're retrieving an array. For each row in that array, I'm echoing out that row, the column name city, the column name phone number, and so on down the line. All right, where that matches the name of the column in the database, that matches the name. This $X represents the row of the database that we're pulling from. This instruction is going to do this as long as there are rows in the database to retrieve. As soon as we run out of rows, we're done. All right, we're done. And this while instruction finishes, we echo the end table tag. And we're done. Now, I can put anything in there for my SQL statement that I want. So for example, if I want to put them in a certain order, the way to do that in SQL would be to say order by city, let's say. And that will give us the list of offices in order by city. So I could go and add that to the command. How they're ordered that way. If you want to do something and like you want to test it out first before you put it in your PHP code, then by all means go and put it in MySQL workbench and run it. So for example, I could only ask for city and phone instead of retrieving all the columns. Let's ask for city, phone, and office code. That's going to give us just those three fields. Now, if I type something in by mistake, it'll tell me that there's a problem with it. So let's go and let's put this in here. Go and modify this, put another table header for code. And I could the dot is used to concatenate. So I'm putting this tags out there. I'm concatenating on this. And that. So it should be okay. Get that. Now I could also use the index. So for example, office code would be item 2 because we start with 0. So 0, 1, 2. So I could do that also. the same result. But I think you can see that's really confusing because what is element 2? You'd have to go back and look at the SQL statement in order to understand what element 2 is. So it's just better in my mind to make it explicit and give the name of the column instead of giving the number of the column. Remember, so many things that you do to make it easier to change later. Yes.
Could you just type the name using the number?
That's what I had a second ago.
Okay, oh, sorry.
Yeah, that's all right. Office code. That's what I'm saying. You can use the number, but it's typically better to use the name instead because that removes any question about it. Okay, your first assignment with this is not difficult. Essentially, you're going to make one of these that looks like a completed web page, except you're going to use the customer table. Are there any questions? The biggest part of this assignment is getting everything installed and configured correctly. The code should be relatively easy if you've done the previous steps well. That's why I'm saying get the setup done early and let me know what issues, if any, that you run into. Yes.
So when I work, I use a still password, but I have to switch it back.
No, just no. No, you wouldn't do that. What I would do, just put a note when you turn it in saying that, you know, I have a different password than password. So then what I'll do is I'll go and edit your code to match my database password. Yeah.
Are we ever gonna have to upload data for this?
No. All right. Any other questions? Okay, we'll either see you in lab or we will see you next week.
I think I have one.
Sure, go ahead.
If we also supposed to style so it looks better.
Right.
How are we supposed to do that?
Yeah, you just do it just like a regular web page. So for example, you should use an external style sheet, but just for simplicity, I'm going to put an internal style sheet. I would just say style table with 90%. Background yellow. Remember, you're going to style to the HTML that this is going to create. You know this is creating a table as the output, therefore your style rules are based on what you're creating. So I could say margin, 0 auto, and this should give me a yellow table that goes across 90% of the page that is centered.
Gotta close the style tag.
Provided that I close the style tag. And there we go. So you know what HTML is going to be created. So that's the style that you style to. A good test, by the way, especially if things don't turn out the way that you expect them to. Like in this case, it turned out the way that I wanted. But if it didn't turn out the way you expected to, is to view the source of what got created. And in this case, it shows you what got created.
Okay. And if you want to like tag a specific row or column, we just use an ID or something.
You'd have to create it with the ID.
Yeah. And okay, fair enough.
Yeah, you'd have to create it. You could say ID equals something like that. And you'd create an ID of style, an ID for special style. Okay, great question. Great question. Anything else? All right, we will see you next week then, or in lab.